Hello, Zer0 Books readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. This video will answer the question, are video games inherently right-wing? By examining the principles of Pac Man, the Situationist International, and the concept of gamification. In his book, The Pac Man Principle, Zer0 Books author Alex Wade argues that the Pac Man is a quintessential subject under capitalism. Pac Man, alone in a maze, is isolated in a world not of his making. Instinctually, he begins to eat and to avoid danger. Wade writes, viewed in this way, it is possible to see how Pac Man becomes a poster child for capitalism. He's indiscriminate because he's naive, but he learns from experience. The Pac Man is the ideal consumer, formed of universal need in the crucible of a labyrinth. He becomes the ideal learner-worker to be deployed within the state of nature of capitalism. But this consumer creature will turn back on his aggressors when given the opportunity. But will the Pac Man turn against his class enemies? And why do these enemies appear as ghosts? In an article for The Guardian, the Zer0 Books author Alfie Bound argued that video games, far from giving us models to follow as we attempt to escape from the capitalist order, ensnare us in ideological constructions which push and impose norms and values upon us while we think we're just having a good time. He points out that video games teach us to fear foreign invaders, acquire territory, build empires, restore what we think of as a natural harmony, and consider women as objects or prizes.
I try to get us a sex, Princess of Peach. She would say no, and then I feel no big loss.
Yeah.
I don't like a sex anyway.
What I want to suggest is that in order to fully understand the potential of video games, we should sweep aside the slag heap of ideological critique that has crusted over our efforts to understand and change the world, and stop thinking about video games in terms of their content, and instead consider what they are. Video games are a form of play, and they are meant to be fun. The historian and philosopher Johann Huizinga is perhaps most well known for his 1938 book Homo Ludens, which translates to Man the Player. In his book, he suggests that human cultures must always contain an element of play. That is, not only do human cultures always contain games and play, but that culture itself is a kind of game. It always has some elements of fun. Later on, in the 50s and 60s, a group of French radicals would find themselves hugely impressed by Huizinga's book. They called themselves the Situationist International, and they argued that socialism's true aim should be to develop a culture where our lives would be fun. True revolutionaries, according to the SI, struggled to replace work with play, to supplant boredom with excitement, and to have a good time as active participants in the game called history.
They want to not only negate art, but in the way De Boer put it, also realize it, which is to say, make of daily life a creative, continuously original, delirious, ecstatic experience.
According to Wikipedia, Johann Huizinga identified 5 characteristics that play must have. Play is free. It is, in fact, freedom. Play is not ordinary or real life. Play is distinct from the ordinary both as to locality and duration. Play demands order to be absolute and supreme. Play is connected with no material interest, and no profit can be gained from it. Despite the second and third aspect of Huizinga's definition, the Situationists wanted to turn real life into a game or into play.
This wide and universal theatre presents more woeful pageants than the scene wherein we play in.
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players.
According to the situationist Raoul Vaneigem, the problem facing contemporary life wasn't that we didn't have enough games. The difficulty wasn't that we didn't have types of play, but rather that the playful impulse had become imprisoned by the demands of capitalist society. The difficulty was that play was subsumed under the reality of commodity production. But perhaps that needn't be the case for much longer. Given how much of our lives is mediated by the very technologies that make the best video games possible, and given that we live in an age where we can have our cell phone direct us to our destination in almost every major city, in an age where 3 to 4 million people play Fortnite together every day, perhaps the material conditions have changed so much that the situationist dream of a society based on gaming could become a reality. Does that sound ridiculous? Well, consider this. In Adam Curtis's documentary, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, the filmmaker interviewed Lauren Carpenter about his 1991 experiment using the game Pong to inspire mass collaboration. In the interview, Carpenter explained how a group of 5,000 people spontaneously figured out how to collaborate and play Pong on a giant screen. This cooperating crowd spontaneously figured out how to work together with a minimum amount of communication and no hierarchical structures of power. There were no overt directions given, but still the crowd was able to figure out how to collectively move the paddle on this big screen and keep the ball bouncing back and forth. They worked together each time in a completely egalitarian way and as a mass. Carpenter viewed his experiment as a demonstration of the possibility of radical democracy. The group mind was made up of 5,000 equal players. Each person worked freely outside of the usual authoritarian mode. However, another way to view this same experiment would be from the opposite perspective. Rather than a demonstration of the efficacy of democratic participation, it demonstrated the efficiency of a dictatorship. After all, while the 5,000 individuals appeared to move as free individuals, it was Carpenter who determined the context and the meaning of their movements. What Carpenter did was establish a very strong power relation, one that was so persuasive that it became almost invisible. In Carpenter's experiment, the mechanism directing human cooperation was a video game. Is it possible that this sort of mechanism, these video games, could replace commodity production itself? Alex Wade suggests that Pac Man might be precisely the kind of subject who can turn against the forces working against him. Pac Man devours ghosts in a struggle for survival. What sort of people do we need to be in order to overturn capitalism? The answer is simple. We should be gamers. Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, then you should click on that like button. While I'm plugging things, I'll remind you that the book The Pac Man Principle was featured in this video. Go find a copy online at your local bookstore or at your local library. You might also click subscribe because YouTube sometimes tells our subscribers when we put up a new video. Finally, if you're not a patron of our Inside Zer0 Books podcast, you should be. So, join us on Patreon.